let's get to Senator Judd Gregg on the Squawk Newsline now. Senator, we checked in with your colleague, Senator Corker, and yesterday you weren't, or today, whenever you were on, you weren't pulling any punches. You don't like this. I couldn't get Corker to say it's a net negative for the U.S., but would you say this is a net negative for the U.S., this thin rig?
My opinion, it is. Primarily because it's going to cause such a large contraction in credit. The derivatives language is, I think, very poorly structured and probably going to force a very significant contraction in derivatives activity and not make it a great deal safer or sounder. And the capitalization language is going to obviously cause the financial industry to have to reposition itself, which means it has to call in loans, usually performing loans, to get its capital up. And the Volcker rule, although it came out better than it started, is still going to cause a lot of dislocation for a while as people adjust to it and try to figure out how you handle the Volcker rule if you're a large bank. So that'll mean a tentativeness at the minimum. So I genuinely believe this bill is going to significantly reduce credit availability across the board in the country, and we didn't really get a whole lot for that. I mean, as a practical matter, the goal was to project into the future a safer and sounder system that would avoid the systemic risk problems we've had. I'm not sure this bill does a lot in that area because it didn't address Fannie or Freddie, and it doesn't address underwriting. And really, we should have had another goal, which would be to keep American markets vibrant in the area of capital formation and credit formation. And I think it actually undermines both those areas.
Well, that's bad. If this, Judd, and I don't know whether it does, but if you could actually prove to me that it will be a net negative for job creation, if I knew that it would prevent another crisis, which it went into causing part of the 10% was the financial crisis, maybe it's worth it if it was just a net. It wouldn't change the playing field for jobs. But if you can prove that it's actually causing job losses and it's not doing what it's expected to do, then that is a net negative for the U.S.
I think that's a pretty easy case to prove just by looking at what was not done in the bill, which was that the underlying problem which created the fiscal crisis, which was real estate lending that was irresponsible and then securitization of that lending, neither of those issues are addressed in any significant way because Fannie Mae is not addressed, Freddie Mac's not addressed, and underwriting's not addressed. And I think it's intuitively obvious just looking at this bill that credit's going to contract, and a contraction in credit, which is done arbitrarily, and that's what's going to happen here. It's not going to be as if it's a reaction to a stronger system. Will inevitably lead to less entrepreneurs having the resources they need to go out and take risks and create jobs.
We were speaking earlier with Dick Beauvais from Rockdale Securities earlier on, Senator, and he said that essentially banks are going to find ways to get around the new regulations. So, you're back to where you start, essentially. So maybe a lot of your fears won't even come to pass.
Well, I don't think there's any question, but markets adjust, and they'll adjust to these regulations, and somebody will be doing business. Whether it'll be in the United States or not is a good question. I do believe a fair amount of the derivatives business will go overseas. Will banks be able to adjust overwhelmingly to the pressure that's going to come on them relative to higher capital requirements and the Volcker rule? I don't think so. I mean, the adjustments will be that they'll do business under the new regimes, but the business of a lot of these financial entities is going to be significantly circumscribed, and that means that American entrepreneurs, and that's the bottom line, Main Street, where people go out and take risks and create jobs, are going to find it's going to be much harder to get credit on Main Street.
Senator Gregg, this is Ann Mulcahy. Just a quick question on the Fannie and Freddie situation. What would you have hoped for that should have been addressed that wouldn't have had even a more negative impact on the banking sector?
Well, I think it might have had a negative impact on the banking sector because Freddie and Fannie are still writing a lot of loans that they shouldn't be. But basically, we should have at least brought them on budget so the American people recognize that there's a huge debt here that has to be paid, probably close to $500 billion. And we should have put in place a program for winding them down, getting them off the off the responsibility of the federal taxpayer, and that program could have been done in a way that would have had phase-ins that would have been responsible and sustainable, but it should have been looked at and it should have been addressed. It's sort of like leaving not only the elephant in the room, it's like leaving the whole herd of elephants in the room if you don't take on and address that issue, because it really was at the epicenter of the problem.
All right, Senator, we appreciate your time this morning. If there was one thing that you could have either put in or taken out, what would it have been? You would have done something with Freddie and Fannie, although you've heard...
No, actually, if you really wanted to do something in the long run to address what was a real estate-driven event, and I've been, like a lot of people who've been in professional life for a while, I've been through 3 of these financial meltdown type of situations, once as governor and once just as an attorney in New Hampshire in the late 70s and governor in the 80s. They were almost all a function of terrible underwriting. People forgetting that you have to have an asset that you're lending to that's worth the amount of worth the loan, and that you have to have somebody who can pay the loan back. And so I would have put in much more aggressive underwriting standards, gone back to the old underwriting standards which were prevalent in the 90s. And we proposed that. In fact, it was Senator Corker's amendment that I helped him and worked with him on. And honestly, if you'd put that amendment in, the bill would have been dramatically improved.
But then there's people that say you're a Republican. You really want to tell people how much you need to put down on a house, or how much capital you need to keep in reserve? That's not the Republican way. The Republican way is to let people do whatever they want, but let them fail.
Yeah, but not take the system with them.
Right. Well, that's why it's a circular way of trying to do it.
Taxpayers coming in and basically underwriting that loan by securitizing it through Freddie and Fannie.
Right.
That loan should be a viable loan. And what we proposed was 5% down, and the next 20%, if it wasn't covered, it would have to be insured over. And that you'd have to have strict underwriting relative to the ability of the person to repay. Those are reasonable rules. They weren't overly aggressive. In fact, compared to places like Australia and Canada, they're still very conservative.
Australia, huh? All right, Senator. Thank you. You're a short timer anyway. You'll be out of there on the golf course. January, right?
Be out looking for credit, I guess. I don't know. Trying to find a loan.
All right. Thank you, Senator Judd Gregg. Well, if you